If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to MINDSHOCK True Crime. You are listening to the Stephen Avery series. This is episode 23, EDTA. So, as a recent commenter on the Stephen Avery podcast on YouTube has pointed out, he actually brought up something that's not excessively talked about currently regarding the Stephen Avery case, which I thought was actually quite interesting. And even though we went over this on earlier episodes in the Stephen Avery series, they're just so comprehensive. It's tough to single out certain points. So I wanted to do another dedicated podcast just on the FBI test for the presence of EDTA and the issues with that, because some people actually point to that being the most damning, as this commenter has done. So here is this comment, which is actually pretty important. So thanks for this comment. And more attention does need to be brought to this aspect, especially for people who think that the FBI test for EDTA was legitimate or that it is somehow incriminating. So here's the comment. I thought the FBI's report about the lack of EDTA in the blood found in the victim's car was one of the most damning pieces of evidence against Stephen Avery. If the defense could prove that FBI report definitely can't be trusted, that would help the defense. Also, it is a big problem that the remains were found on Avery's property. These are the two biggest problems faced by Stephen Avery. And I will get to my response to that, as well as addressing the several hundred-page report on this and all of these little details, because, of course, the truth is not afraid of investigation. And obviously, this was a sham of a trial, and this is one of the most obvious cases of wrongful conviction. Even if these guys are guilty, but there's just no evidence, no real evidence. And what evidence there is, what does it suggest? So we'll be delving into these issues. I'm your host, Bruce McGuire. And as always, if you like the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications. Make sure you allow your device to have those notifications come through. If you like the podcast, hit that like button and share it across social media platforms to keep up awareness, not just in the Stephen Avery, Brendan Dassey wrongful convictions, but other wrongful convictions. Any questions, comments, thoughts, theories, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings, thoughts of any kind, leave them in the comment section. You could also check us out on Twitter, Reddit, Patreon, and Facebook. Patrons do get a priority for case topic requests. All right, so here was my response to the commenter who said that he felt that the lack of EDTA found in a blood test was one of the most damning pieces of evidence, and that the remains being found on Avery's property are these are the two biggest problems faced by Stephen Avery. So here was my response. How so? One, a rushed EDTA test with clear detecting limitations would not detect EDTA 100% of the time, even if it were present. Two, if Avery's blood was planted from his sink and or the bloody rag that Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department had access to, why would that have EDTA in it? So the test is basically irrelevant. The law states beyond a reasonable doubt, finding unidentified remains and the RAV4 planted on his property days after they were not found. Of course, the helicopter flyover footage, the cadaver dogs not hitting on the burn pit during the initial searches, all point to an obvious cover-up and after-the-fact planting. How any functioning human adult or child can believe this evidence is damning or even remotely resembling beyond a reasonable doubt is bizarre. The biggest problem faced by Stephen Avery is the extraordinary amount of corruption and incompetence that prevents him from having a fair trial. It does take many years from law enforcement complicit frame-ups to be exposed, as Zellner has done in the past, so hopefully it won't be much longer. Okay, so I think this sentiment is shared by some people, so let's assume this commenter is not a family member or friend of Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office or any state officials, because it really does seem strange how people can believe that this is beyond a reasonable doubt in any way, or that it's damning evidence in any way. Because you have a RAV4 with a tampered VIN plate that might have not even been Teresa's RAV4 present after not being present during helicopter flyover footage. Okay, you have fingerprints in the vehicle that were never tested. I wonder why. Don't they want to find out the real truth? This investigation is just a botch job all around. So, okay, why? I don't understand this black and white fallacy that if the blood was planted, it would have to be planted from the blood vial with the hole in it. Because I don't understand that line of thinking, because there's so much more access and to not only his blood but more recent samples of his blood. And his blood sample, actually, we do have another DNA for Dummies episode coming up, because even Stephen Avery's own blood has different markers based on when it was taken. Because, I mean, again, these DNA tests are not simple. Certain people have this blind faith that all tests are 100% accurate, and they take the officials administering and interpreting these technologically limited tests, so made by fallible humans. And again, like, how many times do we have to see people exonerated based on DNA matches from decades ago? I don't know why it's so difficult for people to understand that humans aren't perfect, and human technology is not 100% perfect. I don't know why it's so difficult to grasp, but let's pretend it is. Like, let's go that extra step. Let's all get on the scientism train. Let's pretend that just for a moment that the EDTA test is bulletproof. The technology is bulletproof. The people administering the test, they are completely infallible. They're gods that can't make mistakes. Let's pretend the chain of custody would never be violated under any circumstances, and that nobody would ever tamper with any lab results or the interpretation of lab results or reports, even though we have countless cases of that happening. But let's pretend that that is all impossibility. Who said, like, what precludes them planting blood from a non-vial source? Again, the blood in his sink. I mean, he had the cut on his hand. There was a bloody rag that we discussed that was on the property that so-called investigators or law enforcement would have access to, and then the blood in the sink. Not to mention other sources we might not know about. Who said we have to know about the source of the planted blood? It's so bizarre. It's so bizarre. And even I don't know, it's very difficult to fathom how someone could think that that's damning evidence in any way that there was no EDTA found. So again, I think the main theory is that the blood from the sink was used for planting. And again, obviously the RAV4 wasn't even on his property initially. So he got rid of it, then he brought it back. So again, I go over scenarios where he could be guilty. If he has a split personality and one of his personalities is trying to get him caught, then yes. Because if one of the personalities is a mastermind genius, the greatest criminal mastermind in the history of crime, again, to leave no evidence of the murder of Halbach in the trailer or the garage, which the garage might have had so many vehicles in it at that time, nobody would have even fit in there. So again, the cognitive dissonant coincidence theorists, they all completely dismiss all coincidences, all anomalies, and they just say it's all in the up and up. I mean, this case is just such a botch job. Even if it's his blood, again, even if it's his blood, that's still not beyond a reasonable doubt. Because when you have cadaver dogs that don't hit on any remains, so there were no remains found on his property initially. So if he does have a split personality and then his other personality brought the remains back, brought the RAV4 back, okay, even then, when you look at the DNA test for Halbach's remains, the test said she can't be excluded. Does that sound like definitive or beyond a reasonable doubt in any way? I mean, I think 4-year-olds shouldn't have this much trouble understanding logic or the lack thereof in these situations. So, okay, let's get into the EDTA test. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, they did use the blood from the vial the state had, not to mention there were also swabs. I mean, the blood in the vial is not the only way to plant, but let's pretend it is, again, just to soothe these coincidence theorists and examine this. If there was EDTA in the blood sample, would this test detect it definitively? And let's examine that. And let's also examine FBI agent LeBeau's testimony and whether or not he intentionally misrepresented the test and what it alleged, and whether or not he speculated on blood samples not even tested and what they would or would not include in order to narrative steer for the jury or the prosecution. So again, normally these testing procedures, they would take months and months just to do properly and verify. In this case, this was developed in 3 weeks. Okay? And furthermore, this EDTA test, it's not that common, which opens up another can of worms, because especially guilty parties, what do they have to lose if EDTA accidentally showed up in their blood sample? They could just say it was planted by police, right? So there does seem to be no clear procedures for determining whether or not blood was planted by law enforcement, which is, again, some people would think that's not a coincidence, because obviously there's quite a large percentage. I mean, 0.1% would be too large of wrongfully convicted, but depending on which statistics you're looking at, anywhere between 1 and 40% of convictions of people in prison could be innocent and much higher wrongfully convicted, meaning they were guilty, but the law, the standard of beyond of a reasonable doubt, was not even close to met due to either, again, just corruption, planting evidence, even if they were guilty. But the law is the law, so obviously law-abiding individuals would want the law followed to determine guilt. Otherwise, that leaves the door open for many, many innocent people to be in prison due to frame-ups and all of these other things. So the EDTA lab report is over 600 pages. So just quick summary, the final report that was presented for trial, this is what is referenced. And this report is also problematic for a number of different reasons. So regarding the actual data, procedures, and interpretations gleaned from this report, if you try to match these up with FBI agent LeBeau's statements on the stand, it's actually quite troubling at how deceptive LeBeau is. So either he's incompetent or he's corrupt. Now, I do not presume to know which one it is. But in general, obviously you have that blue wall where law enforcement will back law enforcement. So he's not going to assume the law enforcement agents were corrupt. He's going to assume they weren't. I mean, how many government officials are truly objective and neutral? They don't want to be caught being incompetent or corrupt, and they don't want their colleagues being caught being incompetent or corrupt. So they all kind of protect each other, and this is no surprise. You see it all the time. It's very, very rare to have a non-corrupt officer stand up to corrupt officers. It happens, of course, it happens, but just percentage-wise, and especially now with all of these frame-up jobs being exposed currently in the media, one can extrapolate upon how many they actually were in the past that will never be found out about, sadly. But there are some that are found out about. Okay, so here's the main issue. He intentionally conflates qualitative and quantitative results. So the assay of the results, he presents them as qualitative instead of quantitative. So instead of positive or negative, as opposed to the total amount of something, as in percentage of volume of blood, etc. So, again, keep in mind this was a rushed test. So, first of all, it's not a perfect test in the first place. So when you take an imperfect test and then you rush it, obviously it's going to be more imperfect. Some serious flaws and issues. So there was this claim that the LOQ, the limit of quantification for the assay, is 13 micrograms per milliliter. So this is the value of the lowest concentration of EDTA in water that they detected in their assay. So the purpose of that test was to determine the level of EDTA in blood. Okay, so the state was alleging that Stephen Avery's blood did not come from the blood vial because that would have EDTA in it. So the actual LOQ for EDTA in the blood was never determined. So the reason for the lack of a proper LOQ was that the effects of the matrix on the assay. So the matrix is what the chemicals are in. So in the assay, the matrix is the blood. So blood affects the measured value of EDTA, obviously. So in the test of matrix effects, or the effect of the blood on the EDTA, the measured value of EDTA in blood versus water shows that the blood decreased by 97% at one concentration and 60% at another concentration. So, and obviously blood samples are also measured in variable amounts at different concentrations. So once again, in the world of science, you need controls. When you don't have controls, you cannot prove the results are the results of one variable versus another variable. So can we say with definitive certainty that controls were strictly established and followed here? Of course not. So the assay was not accurate in any way when determining EDTA in blood. And so here's the major problem. Lebeau and the cognitive dissonant coincidence theorist Gilders, they obfuscate by saying they dishonestly, or maybe honestly if they don't understand this test, they claim that the result of the test in the water was the actual result in the blood showing there was no EDTA. Which is obviously not true. So Lebeau is either completely incompetent or he's a smart cookie, and he's intentionally misleading everyone, including the jury, because did every member of the jury read the 600-page report? And did they take a test proving that they understood the report perfectly? Every variable, every control, every test, how it was done, the margins of error, etc. If they did, would they think that this test is accurate? So yeah, there's so many problems here. And the other issue is that the final report intentionally doesn't specify these things. The test in the blood versus the water. So if there was EDTA in the RAV4 blood samples of Stephen Avery, the assay wouldn't necessarily have detected them even if they were there. So again, when we're dealing with something regarding beyond a reasonable doubt, is it possible that the test was accurate? Sure. Is it possible that the inaccurate test did not determine EDTA present because it wasn't present? Sure. Is it also possible EDTA was present and this test, which is of course inaccurate, didn't detect it even if it was there? Sure. How is this damning evidence in any way? How could any logical individual accept this as evidence? Because the EDTA could have been present and simply not detected, or they just used blood from a sink or a rag to plant the blood. It didn't have to be from the vial, but it still could have been from the vial. If we're really being scientific and objective and logical, this inaccurate test does not preclude the possibility of EDTA being present. It just means that EDTA was not detected by this inaccurate test. That's all that means. And what people don't like, let's dumb it down a little bit too. In order to have a super accurate test, you need really, really good samples. So how good of a sample are you going to get? I mean, you don't need to even get into the nitty gritty of all of these scientific variables and all of these technicalities. You don't even need to go there. Like, if you take a test right today, you get your blood drawn, you put it in a vial. Next week, you test it for EDTA. Even an inaccurate test would probably detect the EDTA. Because if you have a good quality sample, it's relatively recent, you're not dealing with all of these other variables. So, again, or it's still, I mean, it's not that accurate, so it still might not detect the EDTA, even if the EDTA is there. So, is anyone who's being truly objective, neutral, logical? Are they going to accept this as damning evidence? It's so silly. And the dishonest presentation of the results, I mean, that's just another red flag. So you could add that in a series of endless red flags regarding this case to prosecution. And of course, the morally incorruptible Ken Kratz, who I guess guilters are justified in believing every word of this highly upstanding individual that would never do anything morally shady in any way. So let me close this out by reading this article from Rolling Stone. This was written by Amelia McDonnell Perry. Experts offer concerns over forensic testing in making a murder case. An independent team of scientists explains how blood and DNA evidence might have been mishandled. The Netflix series Making a Murder drew attention to a number of failures in the justice system, from police and prosecutorial misconduct to the collection and scientific analysis of the physical evidence. A group of 4 forensic experts have been conducting a year-long evaluation of forensic evidence from the Stephen Avery case and recently wrote an article for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette which points out a few striking examples of potential shortfalls. Many forensic science methods are inadequately validated, which means they have not been sufficiently tested to establish how well they work and how often and under what conditions they fail, the experts write. Avery's case provides a dramatic example of the uncertainty and confusion that can arise when experts rely on such methods, especially when the court allows the findings to be introduced as scientific evidence at trial. Here are the 2 ways that forensic evidence in the Avery case might have been mishandled. Forensic pitfall number 1, inadequate validation. A DNA test confirmed that the blood found in Teresa Halbach's car was a match for Stephen Avery. However, his trial attorneys theorized that the blood could have been planted from a vial of Avery's blood collected by police years before. Blood from the vial would contain a chemical preservative known as EDTA. Therefore, if EDTA was detected in the blood found in Halbach's car, it had to have been planted. The FBI, at the request of the prosecution, quickly developed a new test to detect EDTA in dried blood. FBI expert Mark LeBeau testified that he tested 3 out of the 6 bloodstains in Halbach's car and did not detect EDTA, and therefore concluded, quote, within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, end quote, that all of the blood in Halbach's car did not contain EDTA. One issue with LeBeau's conclusion, the experts write, is that the swiftness with which the test was developed. There was no time for the extensive research and analysis needed to even know how often and under what conditions EDTA could be detected in dried blood taken from a decades-old vial. Without that research, the experts write, assessing the validity of LeBeau's conclusion is difficult. The fact that LeBeau tested only 50% of the available samples is also cause for concern. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, the experts write. If the quantity of EDTA present in the stains was near the threshold of detection, it might have been detected in some of the stains, but not others. In fact, if only one of the samples had EDTA above the threshold of detection, there was only a 50% chance that it could have been detected in the 3 analyzed samples. Forensics pitfall number 2, contextual bias. The idea of contextual bias acknowledges scientific experts are human. It's possible for their analysis to be influenced by non-scientific aspects of a case. That's why the experts write, forensic scientists sometimes blind themselves to information that is not needed for their tests, such as information about what the police expect and hope they will find. And that's a critical point right there. The researchers pointed to 2 examples of contextual bias that might have affected how the experts in the Avery case conducted their research. For starters, the prosecution gave the FBI an impartial reason for devising the EDTA test. A letter requesting the analysis explicitly states that the purpose of testing the blood was, quote, eliminating the allegation that Avery's vial was used to plant evidence, end quote. There's no way to know whether this influenced the results. LeBeau testified that the blood stains did not contain EDTA, albeit with a certain degree of certainty that the test itself did not support. LeBeau wasn't the only analyst potentially affected by contextual bias. Sherry Culhane, the DNA analyst tasked with testing a bullet found in Avery's garage, wrote in her laboratory notes that she should, quote, try to put Halbach in Avery's house or garage, end quote. When she testified that the expectation, quote, had no bearing on my analysis at all, end quote, the experts write that they find this claim difficult to accept due to the fact that her analysis broke critical aspects of scientific protocol. Culhane's report found traces of Halbach's DNA on the bullet from Avery's garage. However, she also noted that the control samples revealed traces of her own DNA. In other words, the test was tainted. Normal procedure would have had her run the test again, but she couldn't in this case because she had already used the entire sample. That led the experts to wonder whether she would have decided to ignore her own protocol and report the highly problematic results of this test had she not known of the pressing desire of the police to put Halbach in Avery's garage. In other words, because the botched test revealed what the prosecution wanted it to, was Culhane inclined to ignore her own scientific procedures? Ultimately, the experts write, the failures in forensic analysis exhibited in the Avery case are not unique. The popularity of Making a Murderer has helped to illustrate how essential it is that such problems be addressed. When the liberty of a human being is on the line, they conclude, the scientific evidence on which we rely must be as valid, as unbiased as possible. Okay. And these experts that were referenced are academics Lucas Mensch, Maria Sular, William C. Thompson, and Clifford Spiegelman. And what they say is, I mean, it's kind of basic common sense, right? Only those hopelessly indoctrinated into the cult of authority or state worship would view scientism as science. Obviously, this is not real science. This is not real evidence. It's so bizarre how any functioning adult can be a guilter in this scenario. Because it just doesn't make any sense how this dubious pseudoscientific nonsense is accepted as gospel truth in a courtroom. It's bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. Furthermore, LeBeau never actually proved that this new rushed test was in any way accurate. I mean, there's a standard test. They didn't use it. You'd have to prove the standard test is legitimate either. But at least, I mean, that takes months and months of testing, verification, and all these things. They did a rushed test in a few weeks. Has this test ever been used again? This rushed test? Is there any proof this rushed test is accurate in any way? So some people view this as damning. I mean, this is nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. Not to mention, if they planted the blood from the blood in a sink or a bloody rag or some other source, then the EDTA test is irrelevant anyway. But I just wanted to go down this rabbit hole because they could have still used the blood from the vial to plant the blood also. Because this test is not in any way definitive. It's bonkers how people could think that this test is legitimate, that this is real science, that this is some kind of an objective, neutral, definitive science following the scientific method. There's no evidence it did. Not to mention, again, this is all without even going into the possibility that samples are switched. And I'll be doing a dedicated episode on crime lab corruption, because there have been several studies that have found that the number one way that frame-up jobs occurred by law enforcement or state officials were sample switching in the lab. So once again, you'd have to prove chain of custody. This is basic common sense, right? How do we know that this EDTA test was done on the actual blood samples from the RAV4? and again, would have to ignore the fact that the RAV4 wasn't present initially and all that. Let's just pretend it was. Let's just pretend, just for the sake of argument, let's pretend the RAV4 was there the whole time. Let's pretend we know for sure it's Teresa Halbach's RAV4. Let's pretend the fuel gauge and the fuel levels, whenever hidden, let's pretend that's all on the up and up. Let's pretend there's no issue there. So let's pretend we know that the blood stains actually came from the RAV4, which was on his actual property. How do we know that the blood stains tested by the FBI crowd, how do we know that they were sent the correct blood stains to even test? Because let's pretend their EDTA test is scientific and accurate and perfect. Let's pretend all their humans are perfect. I don't know if people are alleging that the FBI would be corrupt and plan. I mean, maybe. I don't know. I'm not alleging that. But let's say can we trace the chain of custody? Because we couldn't do that with Teresa Halbach's remains, which even if we pretend there was uninterrupted chain of custody that could have been proven, they came back as not being able to exclude Teresa Halbach. But we don't even know if those were the remains that were planted on the property, or if we pretend they were found there and they were there the whole time. We can pretend that also, but we have no way to verify that those actual remains were the ones that were tested by the FBI. Just like for this EDTA lab test, can we prove it? Again, if you're going beyond a reasonable doubt, if you're being objective, neutral, scientific, you would have to prove chain of custody, because how do we know someone like Coburn or some other employee of the state crime, or some employee of the state crime, we don't know who's in this diabolical plot to frame Avery. If they have people on the inside, if they have dirt on people, or even if they don't even have to, because if the blood sample that was collected wasn't even the one that was checked in, what if that was swapped in transport by another officer? We don't know any of this, because if it is a frame-up job, then they did swap it, which means that the blood in the RAV4, regardless of what it was, there's no way to verify that was the blood that was tested in the FBI lab, is there? Again, challenge to the guilters: provide irrefutable proof of the chain of custody, because that's what you'd have to do if you're proving beyond a reasonable doubt, right? I mean, this guy's got a $36 million lawsuit, and all of a sudden he's gonna kill somebody in broad daylight with a house full of neighbors and countless people coming and going on the property, which I have another podcast coming up on the large amount of individuals that seem to have been coming and going that afternoon. And Avery's just going to decide to kill someone in his trailer, then he's going to go kill him again in the garage, which possibly has too many vehicles to even do the job. There's just not enough space. And then do the greatest cleanup job in the history of crime, and then put all of the years of dust and grime back, so it looks like there was no crime there, and then not run the RAV4 in the car crusher, or just into the pond, which is right there. Or obviously the RAV4 wasn't there on the initial helicopter flyover, so he took it somewhere else, then he brought it back to frame himself, to implicate himself. Again, if he has a split personality, maybe he did that. But it's all, it's just common sense-wise. If you're proving this beyond a reasonable doubt, it's really, really bizarre how anybody could think that these testing procedures are on the up and up. It's absolutely mind-shocking that people would accept this evidence as beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, maybe it's legitimate, maybe, but the law doesn't work on maybes. I mean, maybe Coburn killed Teresa Halbach and framed Avery. You're not going to put Coburn in prison without actual evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Because maybe he did it. Maybe anybody did it. You're not going to put everybody in prison because of maybes. That's why the law has been established. You have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And you cannot violate people's presumption of innocence. Innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. So that would be the jury's decision of guilt, not holding press conferences. Like this Ken Kratz individual, Peterson. You have all these shady individuals. Nobody's following protocol any step of the way. And people actually continue to defend this conviction as legitimate. I mean, this is one of the most obvious examples of a wrongful conviction, even if Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey, even if they're guilty, even if all of these coincidences, anomalies, constantly changing storylines, regarding the myth of the bonfire, regarding all of these changing timelines, changing stories. Like, let's pretend those are all coincidental, accidental. Even if Avery and Dassey are guilty, this is a clear example of a wrongful conviction because there's just no legitimate evidence. So, yeah, just wanted to address the issue of the EDTA in a dedicated podcast, so now that should clear up any issues people might have had regarding the EDTA FBI test. If you have any further concerns, questions, theories, debunkings, rebuttals, comments, thoughts of any kind, just leave them in the comment section. Hope you enjoyed another edition of MINDSHOCK True Crime in the Stephen Avery series. If you like the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. If you like the podcast, hit the like button. Share it across social media platforms, of which you can find us on Twitter, Reddit, Patreon, Facebook. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.